Hey, English 1102 friends. This is a video taking you through a couple of the conflict and combat poems, My Father on His Shield by Walt McDonald and The Battle by Lewis Simpson. The reason these two are together is because they are both about World War II, what is often recognized now as the last great world war. You know, the wars we've had since then are these sort of smaller scale conflicts. This is the last big, full, just dozens of nations involved war that we had. And many of the people who served in this war are elderly or have died off, and so there's been a lot of reflection on World War II in the past 20 or 30 years. It's also the last war we had where there was a clear enemy and an enemy uniform, and then, us and our uniforms. This obvious conflict between countries. A lot of the wars we fought since then, it's a little hazier, a little less clear. There's terrorists and civilians and things like that involved. The one thing I will point out, the thing that is different about these two poems is if you look at The Battle by Lewis Simpson served in World War II in 1943 and 1944. He served in Europe, fought the Nazis, fought the Germans, and that's very clearly what this poem is about, is this vivid, intense being in a trench and being dug in and fighting in battle. My Father on His Shield, Walt McDonald, was too young to serve in World War II. He remembers his father going over and serving, and that's very clearly his father. This poem is about a father who went off to fight, I believe in the Pacific. Let's see if we can find that. Or maybe you just don't know. But the father went away to fight in World War II and didn't come back. And that's where this poem really starts from, My Father on His Shield. The beginning of this poem is often hard for students to understand now because it's about something that we don't have as much as we used to. This first section, shiny as wax, the cracked veneer scotch taped and brittle. I can't bring my father back, legs crossed, he sits there brash with a private stripe. A world away from the war they would ship him to within days. Cannons flank his face and banners above him. What you're seeing right there, and the only real hint to this, is the shiny as wax, the cracked veneer, scotch taped and brittle. This poem starts off with a picture of his dad, like a hard, old-timey paper picture of his dad with the white back and the glossy front, a true paper picture that he's looking at, and it's this picture of his dad, maybe the last picture taken of his dad. And he tells you, shiny as wax, the cracked veneer, scotch tape. He's had this picture so long, those old paper pictures would dry out and they'd start cracking, especially if you'd folded them. And you'd have to tape them back together. And then he explains to you what it's a picture of. It's a picture of his dad sitting, he's got the private stripe on his uniform, a world away from the war they would ship him to within days. So this picture was taken just a few days before the dad was shipped off, sent away to the war. And it's taken, you assume, like on his military base where he was training or just graduated or was posted before they deployed him. And there's cannons on both sides of him, and between the cannons there's a flag. And then he makes this connection. This is where he reveals to you that the dad died and didn't come back from the war. Banners above him like the flag my mother kept on the mantle, folded tight, white stars sharp pointed on a field of blue. Well, that's obviously the flag that they give you, that they give the family, and in this case his mom, his dad's wife, that they give you when they bring your body back and bury you. And so he makes this connection between the flag and the picture, the flag that his mom got and put on there above their fireplace after the dad was killed. And then you get this flashback where he remembers before any of this, before all of this. I remember his fist, the iron he pounded, 5-pound hammer ringing steel, the frame he made for a sled that winter before the war. And this is something we don't have a lot of in the Deep South, but the dad built a sled. In fact, let's see if we can find that. You see right here, what he's describing here is this old-timey kind of sled that most of us just don't have and wouldn't have any use for in the South. This wood on metal frame with the metal runners there. And what he's talking about right here is how the dad made this sled for him with a hammer and anvil. The frame he made for a sled that winter before the war. I remember the rope in his fist around my chest, his other fist shoving the snow, and downhill we died. His boots by my boots on the tongue. Pines wishing by, ice in my eyes, blinking and squealing. And so he remembers his dad building this sled for them, and then them taking it and going sledding in the snow and the ice and that kind of stuff. He has this very vivid memory of his dad and how strong his dad was. You know, you have to be at least a little strong to hammer out the metal frame of this. And then you get this other memory. I remember the troop train, steam billowing like smoke screen. I remember wrecking the sled weeks later. So when he tries to do it by himself without his dad's help, he has a wreck on the sled. And pounding to beat the iron flat, but it stayed there bent and stacked in the barn by the anvil. And so you get this image at the end. The son has a wreck on the sled. The metal frame that the dad made is bent. And stacked in the barn by the anvil, it stayed there bent, and I can't bring him back. And so you get this double brokenness, this double loss. The sled stays bent. The dad doesn't come back. Things can't go back to the way they were. Without the dad, things can't go back to the way they were. Like life can't go back to the way it was since he didn't come back from the war. And since he didn't come back from the war, there's nobody who can fix the sled. And so it is this image of how war affects not just the soldiers, but the families and the people who stay home. But then are affected in one way or another. You know, the dad was gone, and in this case, he didn't come back. And so it is about the sort of lasting effects, the sort of brokenness that affects even the families, the people who weren't necessarily directly involved in combat, but suffered some kind of loss and brokenness because of what happened. That's very different, though, from the description that you get of the battle by Lewis Simpson. Like I said, Lewis Simpson served in World War II in 1943, 1944. And this is this very intense, vivid, there's a lot of showing in this poem of what it's like to be physically there. Helmet and rifle, pack and overcoat, march through a forest. Well, there you go. You're dropped right into this combat situation. Somewhere up ahead, guns studded, like the circle of a throat. The night on every side was turning red. You know, you got the guns going off, the fires, that kind of stuff. You're marching right into a combat situation. They halted and they dug, they sank like moles. Here's the digging trenches and digging foxholes, getting ready to fight. They sank like moles into the clammy earth between the trees, and soon the sentries standing in their holes felt the first snow. So here's another aspect of combat. You dig in, and it's not comfortable. You know, it's cold, and it starts snowing. Their feet began to freeze. You're dealing with things like your feet freezing and being cold and being wet. At dawn, the first shell landed with a crack. So here they are. You know, it's cold, and their feet are freezing, and then the enemy starts firing on you. Then shells and bullets swept the icy woods. This lasted many days. The snow was black. The corpses stiffened in their scarlet hoods. And so it's cold and people are dying and bodies are freezing. Most clearly of that battle, and here's the twist at the end of this poem, you get all this vivid imagery of snow and feet freezing and shells and the red night just being lit up with fire. But what he remembers most, the most vivid part of this whole experience, most clearly of that battle, I remember the tiredness in eyes, how hands look thin around a cigarette. And so what this poem does is it gives you this sort of you get a broad picture, a sort of wide-angle view of the night being lit up red and the snow falling and feet freezing. But then what you get at the end of this poem is this close-up. The camera pulls in close and focuses in on these very specific close images. The tiredness in eyes, how hands look thin around a cigarette, and the bright ember would pulse with all the life there was within. And so what this poem does is start sort of wide angle, big view, and then focus in at the end on these very close-up images of eyes and hands. And you get that image at the end, the bright ember, you know, the burning part at the end of the cigarette. The bright ember would pulse with all the life there was within. And you get this close-up image of just a little fire. And though these guys are worn down and tired and freezing and just struggling to survive in this situation, there's that little fire still within every one of them, hanging on and fighting, that he uses that little fire at the end of the cigarette to represent that little pulse of life, that little flame inside everybody. Even though they're sitting there freezing and dug in a hole and struggling to survive, there's that fire in them that's keeping them going. And that's all there is left with them trying to hang on and survive. So what this gives you is this sort of difficulties on the home front, and then the struggle, on the front lines. These two poems taken together give you this intense depiction of World War II and surviving it, both being left home and being out on the front lines in a battle. I hope that helps you see the connection between these two and understand how they both show conflict and combat. If you have questions about Walt McDonald or Lewis Simpson or either of these poems, be in touch. Otherwise, thanks